Thank you so much for the very kind invitation to speak here today. In 62 BCE, Cicero defended the Greek poet and his former teacher Aulus Licinius Archias on the charge of falsely claiming Roman citizenship. Cicero's speech in defense of Archias was delivered in a court of law. This type of speech was one of three types of speech in the traditional division of genres in ancient rhetorical theory, and I here reproduce what Aristotle says in his Art of Rhetoric. The first type is the judicial speech, or called sometimes forensic speech because it took place in the Roman Forum. That type of speech concerned the past, offered a judgment about a just or unjust action, and a court decision. The second type of speech was political speech, or sometimes called deliberative speech, because it offered an argument for deliberation, for discussion. That type of speech concerned the future, and it offered a choice of right or wrong course of action. The third type of speech was what we sometimes call praise or blame speech, or epidictic, meaning display speech. That type of speech concerned the future, and it offered a moral judgment about excellent or shameful behavior. In the late Roman Republic, when Cicero delivered this speech, public speech was used mainly in the Roman courts, in the Senate and popular assemblies, and speech was the main means of public communication. There were no national newspapers and there were no mass media such as radio, television, or internet. If one wanted to address a larger audience, one had to deliver a speech live. Romans were trained to do this, by which I mean that men of the Roman elite and sometimes elite male foreigners were trained in rhetoric. Building on their childhood education in language, literature, law, history, and possibly philosophy, adolescent boys of the socio-economic elite would be trained in rhetorical exercises of increasing complexity, might go to the Roman Forum to observe experienced orators delivering speeches, and a few might even go abroad to train with the best rhetoricians in the Greek-speaking eastern parts of the Roman Empire. This was an elite education for an elite segment of society, usually the sons or grandsons of senators or wealthy families with political ambitions. To nurture a political career, i.e., getting elected by the Roman people and wielding influence with the people and peers, it was necessary to speak in public. One did not need to speak frequently or to be a brilliant orator. Indeed, one did not need to be a Cicero, but one did need to speak when called in the Senate or when asked to address the popular assembly, and one also needed to speak with a certain level of skill so as not to embarrass oneself. The evaluators of this skill depended on the type of speech, whether the Roman people in the popular assemblies, fellow senators in the Senate, or the jury or judge in the courts. The jury or the judge in the courts at the time that Cicero was defending Archias consisted of senators, equites, and tribuni aerarii, who all belonged to the socio-economic elite. However, the Roman courts were public, taking place in the Roman Forum, and onlookers, called the corona, the ring, could informally influence an advocate and his speech. And this is worth keeping in mind for all such forensic speeches, including Cicero's for Archias. So let's think a little bit more about Archias's trial. Cicero defended Archias on the charge of falsely claiming Roman citizenship under the Lex Plautia Papiria. Although Roman citizenship had recently been expanded to all Italian communities as a result of the social war, grants of citizenship to individuals were not common in the late Roman Republican period. The Plautian and Papirian law of 89 or 88 BCE offered Roman citizenship to men who had received local citizenship in Italian cities, lived permanently in Italy, and who appeared before a praetor to claim it within 60 days. Cicero says this in chapter 7 of the speech. And this was apparently the route by which Archias had claimed citizenship. Aulus Licinius Archias, we don't know when he was born or when he died, but we do know that he was a Greek poet from Antioch. And I have on this map given you some indications with these stars where these different places are. So Antioch in Syria is where Archias came from, and he arrived in Rome in circa 102 BCE. Cicero argues in the speech that Archias first traveled from Antioch to Greece and southern Italy. He mentions Tarentum, Rhegium, and Neapolis, and then on to Rome. In Rome, he enjoyed the patronage of the Luculi, Metellus Numidicus and his son Metellus Pius, Quintus Catulus, and he also knew other elite Romans whom Cicero lists in the speech. Archias then went to Sicily, which was then a Roman province, with Marcus Licinius Lucullus, and he returned to Rome via Heraclea in Lucania, the Green Star, probably in 93 BCE. Heraclea had full Roman citizenship rights, and it was Archias's enrollment as an honorary citizen of Heraclea which later qualified him to Roman citizenship by appearance before a praetor in Rome, taking the family name of Lucullus, namely Licinius. During the 80s and 70s, Archias accompanied Lucius Licinius Lucullus, so Marcus's brother, to the east and in the Third Mithridatic War, when Lucullus was the commander of the Roman army. Archias's historical poem on the Mithridatic War, which Cicero mentions in chapter 21, was a commission from Lucullus and must have been laudatory of Archias's patron. Cicero's defense advocate, Marcus Tullius Cicero, was, at the time of the trial in 62, Rome's most famous advocate and orator, as well as a recent consular. Cicero was also a connoisseur of poetry and literature more generally, which he used to great effect in his speech for Archias. He was therefore an excellent choice of defense counsel and an influential politician, even though his handling of the Catilinarian conspiracy at the end of 63 had led to criticism and some loss of standing in the political elite. The prosecutor of Archias was a man called Gratius. The fact that we know so little about him, yet Archias's trial was so politically potent, suggests that Gratius was a front for other, more powerful people like Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey. Pompey was a political opponent of Archias's patron Lucullus, not least after Lucullus's command against Mithridates had been transferred to Pompey through a tribunician law in 66 BCE. The presiding judge in Archias's trial, one of the praetors, was Cicero's brother, Quintus Tullius Cicero, although Cicero does not make much of this fact in his speech, likely to avoid allegations of collusion with the judge. So that's what I want to say initially about the trial, and I now move on to the sources. So from where do we have all this information that I've just been telling you about? Well, almost all the information about the trial and about Archias comes from Cicero's speech, or a few other works by Cicero or other works dependent on Cicero's speech, and I've listed them here on the slide. That means that we have only one side of the argument, which creates potential for bias. It does not mean that we have to reject everything Cicero says as untrustworthy, but we do need to consider every piece of information and every argument carefully before taking it as a fact. This is particularly important if you want to understand historical, political, or legal aspects, such as Archias's position, the reasons for his trial, or whether he was guilty or not. But it is less important if you're interested in the speech for its rhetorical or linguistic qualities. Archias's poetry has unfortunately not survived, unless you think authentic the poems in the Greek anthology under his name, of which I think Caspar will speak a little bit more later on. And so Cicero's descriptions are the fullest sources we possess. Moving back to the trial and a bit more about the argument. So Archias was prosecuted in 62 of unlawfully residing in Rome without proof of Roman citizenship. In 65, the tribune Gaius Papius passed a law expelling from Rome all non-citizens without a fixed residence in Italy. Anyone who could not prove their citizenship were open for prosecution. The key point in Archias's prosecution was the absence of written proof of his citizenship at Heraclea, and of his conversion of this into Roman citizenship under the Lex Plautia Papiria. As Cicero tells us, Archias was not listed in the Heraclean citizen rolls or in the Roman census lists. Cicero counters this problem by bringing in Marcus Lucullus and a delegation from Heraclea to give testimony to Archias's grant of citizenship there, and by citing the list of new citizens under the Lex Plautia Papiria, which the then praetor Quintus Metellus Pius compiled. Additionally, Cicero argues a little bit later in the speech, chapters 25 and 26, that Archias could not have claimed the status benefits of citizenship had those around him, including many elite Romans, not thought him eligible of citizenship. The question remained not whether he was eligible for Roman citizenship, but whether he had actually claimed it. So far, Cicero's judicial defense. The largest part of Cicero's defense was not judicial, but ethical. In other words, that Archias was morally entitled to Roman citizenship because he praised the Romans and their empire in his poetry. Cicero's main points in this argument are his own interest and pleasure in literature and the value of literature to statesmen, and therefore the honor to be shown to the producers of that literature, including poetry, as a spur to glorious action on behalf of Rome. In order to make this argument, Cicero brings in his own experience of statesmanship during the Catilinarian conspiracy the previous year, parallel cases of poets contributing to Rome's glory, such as Rome's foremost epic poet, Ennius, and he even compares Archias to the foremost epic poet, Homer. As their poetry sang the praises of Rome, Troy, and Greece, and as their poetic achievements were claimed by the Romans and competing Greek states, so should Archias's poetic praise of Roman achievements against King Mithridates be claimed, cherished, and rewarded by the Romans. Interestingly, for a speech about entitlement to Roman citizenship, Cicero does not depict the Syrian Archias as a Roman, but rather as a good immigrant embodying Greek cultural identity. His home city of Antioch is presented as an intellectual and cultural center. Archias's Italian networks are very much in the Greek-speaking south, and he writes in Greek about the Romans. Scholars have discussed Cicero's choice of rhetorical strategy, and Steele has suggested that Cicero presented Archias as an opportunity to the Romans to either show their superior humanity and cultural enlightenment by accepting Archias as a fellow citizen, or, as Chulek-Baird has argued, that this was an opportunity to the Romans to refill Rome with values currently degraded or lacking, namely Archias's contribution to national ideology of the glory of territorial expansion. Now move on to rhetoric. So what do we actually mean when we say rhetoric? I've given here some more popular usages of that word. But rhetoric is much more than words. It can also be gestures, behavior, and appearance. But today, when I say rhetoric, I mean the structure, the argument, the rhetorical figures and devices, i.e. the style, and the delivery of a speech. Now, we know next to nothing about Cicero's delivery of his defense of Archias, so I'm interested in finding out what you're going to talk about in terms of the actio of the speech in one of your later events. And I have already mentioned the main arguments of the speech. But what about the structure, the appeals, and the style of the speech? I can't go into detail here within the time limit, but I can give you a little bit of a flavor of how to approach this. So the structure of the Pro Archia is relatively straightforward, following the standard structure of forensic speech as advised in the ancient rhetorical handbooks. First, an introduction, the exordium, then a narratio, which is not necessarily a narrative, but it's setting out the facts of the case, Archias's career and how he became a Roman citizen. Then comes the confirmatio, which are the arguments based on the facts that are just explained in the narratio. And in this particular speech, a digression, although it is very much supporting the overall argument, it's not a digression for its own sake. And finally, a conclusio, a conclusion. Cicero does not include an obvious reprehensio, or refutation of the prosecutor's arguments, unless we consider chapters 10 to 12 as a refutation of the argument that Archias was not a Roman citizen because he had no written proof of his status. The structure here reveals just how substantial Cicero's discussion of literature and its value was. 19 chapters out of 32, so almost 60% of the speech. This part is therefore not just a digression out of love of literature, although Cicero had that, but a vital part of Cicero's overall rhetorical strategy. Scholars have recognized this and offered a number of interpretations, some of which I've already mentioned. The style of the speech concerns the choice and positioning of words and rhetorical figures such as alliteration, metaphor, contrast, and many, many others, but also the choice and use of appeals. And I've given you here the Aristotelian appeals, and I'll explain them a little bit more. So the first one is ethos, which is a point which is used and relying on the speaker's character. The second one is logos, which is a point relying on what seems to be a logical argument. And finally, pathos, a point that relies on putting the audience in a certain frame of mind, usually an emotion. So when Cicero speaks about himself, for example, being boosted to great achievements on behalf of the Roman state when reading great poetry, he's using ethos. When Cicero argues that Archias' citizenship status is proved by the witness statements of Marcus Lucullus and the Heraclean delegation, and by Metellus' list of new citizens, he's using logos. And when Cicero argues poets' contribution to the glory of Rome, including the contribution of Archias, he's using pathos. Rhetorical devices in the speech are plentiful, so I will just point out a very few for illustration, all in the first famous sentence that Caspar also mentioned. Throughout the speech, but very strongly in the opening sentence, Cicero tries to support his overall argument about the value of literature and Archias' contribution to this by showing, not just claiming, his own skill in elegant style. So in the opening sentence, he does this through balanced clauses and a complex sentence structure. So I tried to put the first sentence here, but organizing it so it's a little bit clearer how the structure is. And I've given you Barry's translation underneath that. So here we see in this first sentence a repetition in structure. So we have the three protases, siquid, aut siqua, aut sihuiusque, and then followed by the apodosis at the end that solves the tension of all these if. We also see a repetition in word choice with variations. So siquid, siqua, sihuiusque. And we see a repetition of word endings in the apodosis, earum, rerum, omnium, and a little bit further, fructum. There are many other things one could say even about this first sentence, but just to give you a little bit of a flavor of how one might approach style. And I'll now move on quickly to the political context of this speech. So why was Archias prosecuted? No scholars think that it was xenophobia as such, but rather political reasons which led to the trial. Archias was the protege of the Lucullus family, had written his poem about Rome's victories in the Mithridatic War when accompanying Lucius Lucullus in the war, and Lucullus had been replaced by Pompey as the Roman commander in 66. Continuing political competition and sometimes open enmity between the leading politician and commanders was not new in Roman politics, and the use of the courts to gain advantages and inflict embarrassment was rife in the 60s BCE. Archias was prosecuted as a friend and a protege of the Lucullus family, not as an unlawful claimant of Roman citizenship. As Eric Gruen has put it, the object was less to secure conviction than to employ the courts as a vehicle for embarrassment of political foes. Cicero, as a top politician who nevertheless could not afford to alienate other powerful politicians, had to balance his defense of Archias and therefore the Lucullus family with the need to avoid offending the political enemy of the Lucullus family, Pompey. We can see this mainly in his silences in the speech. So in his discussion of Archias' poem on the Mithridatic War, he does not describe the content, which we presume must be the praise of Lucullus, but rather the effect. And Cicero generally avoids mentioning the political background to the speech, or even Pompey. Cicero's careful balancing paid off in the sense that he did not offend Pompey, who returned to Rome later in 62 after his military successes against Mithridates. If we try to briefly place this speech within Cicero's overall oeuvre, we can see that his defense of Archias was one of circa 57 known forensic speeches, of which 30 have survived. Compared to Cicero's political speeches, i.e. those both in assemblies and the Senate, this presents roughly half of the known and half of the surviving speeches. Very few of Cicero's speeches are generally categorized as only epidactic speeches, but most of his forensic and deliberative speeches contain elements of praise and blame. The Pro Archia also presents a kind of temporal middle point in his career between the first and the last known speeches, the Pro Quinctia of 81 and the final Philippic speech of 43. The speech can also be read alongside Cicero's defense on similar charges of Balbus in 56, or as part of a number of speeches in which he touched on aspects of Roman territorial expansion, imperial glory, and provincial administration. So, for example, the speeches in Verum, Pro Lega Manilia, Pro Flacco, and De Provincis Consularibus. The speech is an excellent demonstration of Roman attitudes to foreigners and their own empire, the intricacies of domestic politics at Rome, and of Cicero's rhetorical brilliance. Thank you. My last slide has a bit of bibliography if you want to learn more.